Go.
Thanks, Joyce. I'm going to be working off some notes today, and I've been very careful about the articulation I'm using to merge two very different fields of thought. There are a lot of parallels, but they're still quite separate. And it's been very good to hear a lot of, in the previous talks, a lot of things touching on things we'll cover in the talk today. So Vlad and I were drawn to this topic after a phone call where Vlad mentioned the paper to me, and it's by Carhart, Harris et al., 2014. And the entropic brain theory, straight away I was able to draw parallels to what it's describing to what I've been teaching to people in the circle that I hold. So I hold a psychic development circle in Melbourne. And the term loose mind is not a sexual reference. It's not loose women or anything like that. It is just literally not having a rigid, constrained mind, belief system, consciousness, being loose enough and receptive enough to the variance in the psychic and, an energy that we perceive through our clairsenses. So it basically, Vlad will describe more of the theory around the mind and how this works. And then I'll explain more about how this is the entropic functions can act as a precursor to the ability to receive psychic information.
Okay. All right. So in this portion of the presentation, or my part of the presentation, I wanted to, cover some of the basics, the neuroscience of the entropic brain theory, and then see how it overlaps with parapsychological phenomena. So essentially psi, information, ESP, all those kind of things, because there is an overlap, and it's interesting how it's actually coming about, even with mainstream science. So first of all, I wanted to give you a definition of what entropy actually is, talk about how it applies to the brain, discuss which parts of the brain are involved in this theory, and then how it links to potential parapsychological phenomena, mainly psi. And then I'll hand it over to Cherie, and she'll talk about some examples of consciousness in relation to the entropic brain theory, do various comparisons with spiritualism, and psychic work, and so on. Okay? And then what's the last one? How to use the neuroscientific information to enhance spiritual experiences and other phenomena. Okay. So entropy, very, very simple definition of entropy, is displayed very nicely with the cookies or the biscuits. Cookie that's all together, held together, solid cookie, is in low disorder. That's something that's very stable, very non-random, good solid, low disorder. That's referred to as low entropy. The smashed cookie, it's highly disordered, highly random. That's essentially termed high entropy. Another example might be if you have water, for example. If we start off with an ice cube is very solid. Atoms are fairly ordered, right? So in a fairly low state of entropy. As it melts, it becomes more entropic, higher level of entropy. And then if we boil it, we actually make it evaporate or cause steam. That's in its highest kind of level of entropy. So that's kind of the idea. Another one might be if you buy a brand new couch and then your kids punish it with food, drink, the cat uses it as a scratching post, and before you know it, it's in hard waste collection. That's the path of entropy of most things in life. All right? How it applies to the brain is the idea of the theory of the entropic brain is a way of trying to categorize different states of consciousness along a spectrum based on the level of order or disorder in the brain activity that's actually supposedly underlies that state of consciousness. So, for example, very, very ordered, very low entropic states might include things like obsessive compulsive disorder or depression, where the thoughts are very entrenched, very cyclical, and that doesn't really deviate very much. It's could be considered as a low entropy, very high order brain state. On the other end of the spectrum, we might have very random states of consciousness. These would be things like dreaming. If you're dreaming, you're in a very non-linear kind of flow, making creative connections all over the place. Another one might be near-death experiences. So it's a very similar thing. So you can see that there's a spectrum of different brain states. And the entropic brain theory is just trying to kind of get an idea of, can we qualitatively or quantitatively categorize these along the scale? So what else did I want to say here? Yeah, when we talk about brain entropy, from a scientific perspective, it's actually quite a tricky thing to do. It's a technical way of measuring different brain states and action potentials firing and EEGs and MRIs and all this stuff. But essentially what you can boil down to is the strength of connection between different brain regions. Okay, so you might have a couple of different brain regions that are very strongly connected. There's a strong functional connection between them, and the two are in phase. So when one is active, the other one's active at the same frequency. That's in those states, you've got a very highly ordered brain state, and that would be called that low entropic state. On the other hand, when the two different important brain regions start going out of phase, the connection between them fades. That's a high entropy state. It becomes disordered, and potentially that becomes more prone to these creative states. All right, so a lot of the material I'm presenting is from one key paper by the Carhart-Harris, and they did a lot of work, a lot of studies over a decade or so, looking at inducing these entropic states using psychedelics. So they would give participants psilocybin, magic mushroom, in very small doses, and then monitor them under MRI for different changes in brain activity. And this is kind of their diagram, which summarizes all of their research. So it's actually a really nice diagram. What we have here is this inverted U relationship between states of consciousness and entropy. So if you look on one side, we have these low entropic states, very rigid, potentially rigid states of thinking on one end, and this is the list here. I mentioned obsessive compulsive disorder and depression, for example, being some, and there's other examples there, all the way down to sedation and coma, where I'm not sure how much consciousness you have in a coma. But there have actually been examples where people come out of coma and actually report being able to hear voices and actually still hear family members talking to them in the hospital. Anyway, so that's one side. On the other end of this scale are the high entropic states, the very flexible states where the connectivity in the brain has diminished and the brain's kind of doing its own thing. And again, on this end, we have things like dreams, sleeping, near-death experiences, and quite a few other things, including some things like sensory deprivation, early psychosis. These are all states that are non-linear type of processes going through. Normal waking state. So normal functioning waking under normal conditions is just over here on that scale. Primary consciousness is what the authors refer to as these more flexible creative states. The other thing to note is this idea of criticality. So we've got this critical point, and what that really is, it's a very fine, it's a transition zone between very ordered thinking and the more disordered states of mind or states of consciousness. It's a very, very thin zone where the brain activity is primed just at the right level to be pushed one way or the other. So it's a little trigger point almost. Now, normal waking consciousness is more towards this ordered state, and that's actually perfectly designed because it puts the mind in a state where it's grounded, able to deal with real world environments, situations. So it's great for reality testing, and it's great for self-awareness. Okay, so these are two very important things for not getting hit by a bus when you're trying to cross the road. Right? You're in the real world. You've got to deal with it. So your brain has to be primed for the real world and a good solid sense of who you are. Now, to push this arrow over in this direction, which is what all the research with the psychedelics has been done, I should say that's probably not the best way of doing it. There are much better ways for personal development, including meditation. Meditation can do that as well. But when we push it in this direction, that sense of self and that reality testing that's normally in place, that can kind of takes a back step in preference for more non-linear thinking styles. And Cherie and I are proposing that it's when we nudge it past this critical point, that's when these states of mind perhaps allow or are more conducive to other information coming up into your conscious awareness. You become more aware of it. And I believe that's essentially what Cherie does when she does her mediumistic sessions. Does that make sense so far? Yeah. All right, let's see if I've missed anything. All right, so go to the actual brain regions that are involved in this. So the study using the psychedelics essentially found two regions which are critical to this, intimately related. One of them is called the default mode network, and it's a network of three distinct parts of the brain that always work in tandem. And then there's a strong link also to a second part of the brain called the medial temporal lobe. And altogether, these regions, there's a pretty strong evidence that these three regions are what helps us or modulates our ability to move between these different conscious states. Okay, so the default mode network. As you see here, there's a diagram here showing the different brain regions lit up. Okay, it's a set of three regions. I've labeled them here for you if that helps in any way. Got the middle medial prefrontal cortex. We have the posterior cingulate and the angular gyrus. I wouldn't worry too much if it doesn't make any sense to you, but that's just an MRI scan showing the overall results of which parts of the brain light up. Now, the default mode network is the activity in it only really lights up when a person is no longer engaged in the external world. They're not engaged in any demanding external task. It's when you sit down and you just relax and you start ruminating, thinking internally. So it lights up when we have internally directed thoughts. So thoughts about yourself, thinking about others or what they think about you or things like that. Thinking about past and present, daydreaming, mind wandering, all those kinds of activities is where this lights up. And the way it does it, and a few other things, actually makes a lot of scientists believe that this default network could be the physical counterpart to what's considered your self, your self narrative, your ego, essentially. Part of the one other little anomaly is that these three regions, this network, uses much more energy than any other part of the brain, and they don't fully understand why. So it uses about 40% more energy than other regions. Not entirely understood why that is. And even when it's switched off, right, this network switches off. As soon as you've got a physical task to do, you have to go and drive the car, you have to go and deal with the kids outside or something. This network shuts down, and this still uses more energy, even when it's not active. Okay. So, I should just point out, because I think Cherie will cover that point, this default mode network clearly works only for, kicks in when you're directing internal thoughts. When this shuts down and you have to have real world tasks, you have a polar opposite network called the task positive network, which kicks in. So it's like a seesaw. If the task positive network is functioning, the default mode network shuts down, and vice versa. And this might become important, I think, for one of Cherie's slides. Okay. So when the default mode network is actually altered, when it's modified in experiments, people usually experience very changes in their states of mind, including, if you go to the very extreme, kind of almost a dissolution of the ego. And when it comes to parapsychological phenomena, this default mode network may very well act as a filter which under normal conditions, normal waking consciousness, actually blocks all the psi information that comes to the brain. And there's quite a bit of parapsychological research now suggesting exactly that. So there's a couple of papers. An old paper back in 2009 or so, they found that there are patients who had damage to the left frontal lobe. This is actually, I've circled the left lobe. It's the radiological convention. You have to, when you look at the scans, you're looking from the feet up. So it's on the left side. I didn't do it incorrectly. All right. When there's damage, patients who had damage to that part of the brain, so it was non-functional, they found that they were better able, or they were actually able to have exhibit micro PK, which is micro psychokinesis. They were able to influence a random event generator. If you don't know anything about random event generators, think of coin flipping, right? Heads or tails, but this is coin flipping hundreds of times per second continuously. And the patients were able to actually push that random event, either positive or negative, depending on the task. And they thought, that's odd. Why is lack of activity in that part of the brain causing them to allow, to get a significant deviation in the random event generator? So move on to 2023. This was literally published about 2 weeks ago. This is very, very new data. Friedman got regular participants, members of the public, into a lab, and he artificially suppressed the activity in that part of the brain using magnetic fields. He used transcranial magnetic stimulation to suppress activity there for about 20 minutes or so. And he found exactly the same thing. They were able to significantly change the direction of this random event generator, which mainstream science would say that's impossible. Right? So that, to me, suggests that this is the part of the default mode network, plays a role in it. If we can suppress that default mode network a little bit, things can start to happen. All right, so that's one part. The other part of this network, as I mentioned, is the temporal lobe, and the connection between the default mode network and the temporal lobe. So there's a very strong connection between them, and also the activity is quite important. This is the temporal lobe. The part we're actually interested in is kind of inside. You have to remove it, and there's a little part inside called the medial temporal lobe. It's more to do with memory than anything else. And in the study by Carhart-Harris, when they gave psychedelics, they found that as you go into these higher states, these more creative states, the entropic states, the connectivity between the default mode network and the temporal lobe reduced. So the activity in the default mode network actually reduced itself. The activity in the temporal lobe reduced, and also the communication between the two also reduced. So things just started going out of phase and doing their own thing. And they found that this is actually pretty important in the whole process. On a side note, because this was done with psychedelics, with LSD and psilocybin, there's evidence that if that part of the medial temporal lobe is removed, or patients who have damage to that part of the brain, psychedelics like LSD have no effect on them. They can't get that psychedelic state. if that part's removed. So it looks like it's pretty critical in the whole process. All right. In terms of parapsychological aspects, there's been a lot of work looking at weak magnetic fields or stimulation of the temporal lobe with weak magnetic fields. Some of you may know Michael Persinger is fairly well known. He did a lot of work with stimulating the temporal lobes, and he found that he could induce quite a few interesting sensations, including sense presence. This is it's essentially very common in ghosts and hauntings. People will just suddenly, all of a sudden, feel like there's something right next to them, or there's something in the room with them. I had a participant in a study who was doing MRI scans, and the participant walked out of the MRI scanner saying, I felt there was an angel just right next to my head the entire time I had the scan. So she felt like there was a guardian angel just looking over her, which leads on to more mystical religious experiences. They can be induced as well. People report feelings like Jesus or some heavenly entity is there in the room with them. Deja vu is probably more common, and also potentially out-of-body experiences. So these are all things that have been reported when you stimulate the temporal lobe. And all of this kind of came down to the idea that the communication between the temporal lobe and other brain regions, and that seems to now be the default mode network, the communication between them is caused by what they term hyperconnection, but really what it means unusual activity in the temporal lobe, communicating with other parts of the brain. All right, so to kind of summarize the neuroscience aspect, we can essentially state under normal conditions that we're operating quite now, we have the default mode network and we have the temporal lobe. And the important thing is the connectivity within the temporal lobe, within the default mode network is very strong. The communication between the default mode network and the medial temporal lobe is very strong. Everything's working, strong connection, strong synchrony between the different brain regions. And this is great for keeping us grounded, keeping us in that reality testing mode, and who we are. But that essentially is blocking what the potential psi information that comes through. As we reduce the communication or reduce the default mode network through either psychedelics or meditation or any number, there's a few other ways you can do it. I think Cherie will touch on that. The communication within the network will reduce. There should be an arrow here, but there isn't. So the communication between the temporal lobe and the network will also reduce. And that essentially allows the stuff to come through. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. Beautiful. All right, I think I'm going to hand over to you.
Okay, so something else the paper discusses is primary and secondary consciousness. So when I talk about consciousness, however, I'm not just referring to the mind or the brain and its functions. When I work with others to facilitate psychic development and within the religion of spiritualism and performing mediumship, there are constant reminders to move out of the mind and away from intellectualizing, because consciousness, spirituality, and psychic work and mediumship is not seated in the mind. It is, to me, a holistic, subjective, internal experience that is shaped by innumerable aspects in a multidimensional way that especially uses the energy of emotions. And this is very much in line with what this paper describes as primary states of consciousness. So, primary consciousness in relation to a highly entropic mind means cognition is less meticulous in sampling the external world. And also it's easily biased by emotion. So things like wishes and anxieties become more pronounced. According to Sigmund Freud, it is a primitive style of thinking, dominant in human infancy and primordial man, preceding the development of the ego in the human adult. So within the Carhart paper, they reference Walter Stace's 7 universal components of the spiritual experience, all of which are present when performing mediumship and psychic work. However, the psychic and mediumship development when practicing spiritualism or mediumship, the way of holding yourself holistically can come through the self-work, practice, and teachings available through spiritualism. And once you're at a genuine level of being able to channel and perform other forms of psychic connection, there is profound insight, teachings, wisdom, and guidance that can be received, as well as the benefit of entering into highly entropic mind states frequently. And we heard a little bit from Tom about some of the information that can come through from channeling and meditation. Okay, so things that reduce DMN activity, as Vlad was talking about, and reduce connectivity between the brain regions are things like drugs. So psilocybin or LSD have dramatic effects on both the connections between the pathways as well as the brain regions themselves. Meditation and mindfulness reduce the demand on the DMN, so long as the mind stays on point. Mediumship, this is a secondary condition that arises from other primary states or predispositions. Dreaming, sleep states are known for their creative processes. Many examples of artists and scientists have creative insights and revelations during dream states. Magnetic stimulation, so the Michael Persinger's God helmet, that's what I was talking about, and even binaural beats can potentially cause these effects.
Sorry, can I just interrupt?
Yep.
The reason I put in the auditory binaural beats with a question mark, because I'm not sure it definitely does, but I can't be certain that it absolutely does cause any changes in primary consciousness. But one of the things that came out in the paper was that the 13 hertz stimulation occurs in the brain during this process, during the psilocybin process. And so potentially, if we stimulate with 13 hertz stimulation in the ears, that could potentially also assist the process. So that's why I put that in there.
Yeah.
So
I can add to that too, that I wrote a paper a few years ago talking about rapid eye movement therapy. And people can actually sense a presence in the room when they're having that form of therapy as well. So there is something in the binaural aspect. So to add also for me, deciding to have a positive lifestyle as a start can make a huge difference, and being aware of conflict and other ways your life may have negativity, working on ourselves with things like repairing psychology, trauma from childhood issues, really frees up a lot of blocks and rigidity that people have as coping mechanisms. They just haven't had the need or opportunity to look at before. So particularly for access to full emotional range. As I mentioned, emotional intelligence is really important when you begin working with the highly entropic mind, because there are things you're confronted with and things that you may experience when you're working with others that basically spirit will use as a conduit for information and communication. So next slide. So the entropic brain state is not psychic awareness itself. It can be a precursor and creates the right environment in someone's conscious experience for more or something beyond a 3D reality to be received. In itself, it does not guarantee psychic experience or genuine psychic connection. Some of the altered conscious states that are often confused with being entirely psychic are the following. So dreaming, I hear a lot of people just taking every dream they have as being a significant message or some kind of psychic experience, but it's not. Clearly, some of it's just your brain processing information that's been received. onset phase psychosis. So this is quite common and is when someone may show signs of losing contact with reality because of a number of factors. In this state, people are often not able to be self-aware enough to understand that others are not interpreting those situations as they are. They see often everything as a spiritual experience, and they've drifted too far into supercriticality on the scale that we were showing, which has its own set of negative circumstances, as Vlad may have shown. As we now know, primary states of consciousness, with primary states of consciousness, the secondary abilities to be self-aware are diminished in clients experiencing onset phase psychosis, which also happens with clients who may be experiencing drug-induced psychosis. And that's unfortunately something I've had to work with in clients, and I've witnessed quite a bit. So in any case, when someone is in these phases, extreme grounding is recommended so that someone can return to a secondary state and move out of that primary state they find themselves in. So monotonous physical tasks, exercise, and simple routines that focus on minimizing sensory input is needed. And things like that also activate the task positive network that Vlad mentioned, so goal-oriented behavior, which can start shifting the mind into something external. Okay, so I personally don't advocate for drugs. I have worked alongside practitioners who use drugs at times, but in this study, they clearly say that psychedelic drugs are used as a blunt instrument primarily to study consciousness. And even the authors recommend therapeutic care for anyone deciding to use psychedelics for other reasons or any reason. So drugs are not necessary for psychic development, and in fact, safely increasing what we'll call a higher entropic consciousness or a looser mind with steady practice is more powerful for several reasons, which I won't run through. But basically, if we want to give a metaphor for the difference, using drugs is like bringing on an acute experience of spiritual, entropic, whatever label you want to use. It's acute, so it's short and intense. Whereas the gradual psychic development and meditation work and personal work and healing, you could say, is more chronic, but it's more powerful because you have full control over that. So in the circle too, I used to describe how sensory deprivation can actually heighten your senses. And you may think, well, what does the fact I may smell more or hear more have to do with anything? But our brain actually interprets sensory information through the clear senses, even though it's not present for other people. So our brain comes to understand that process. And by heightening your own physical senses, you also refine your brain's capacity to be able to interpret sensory information on a clairvoyant scale, on a clairaudient, etc. scale. And so often people think too, psychic information is something that is external to the self, which it can be with some paranormal activity, but most psychic work is entirely internal and a perceptive, subjective process. So learning to work with the senses and be aware of your own senses is very important. The fact I'm a medium, I just believe in the afterlife. I've spoken with, many spirits. So I believe near-death experiences are more likely to have a very psychic, high-level component of connection in them rather than not. But obviously we can't know for sure. Yeah. Okay, so these are parallels of aspects of spiritualism compared with the theory. In readings, I'm often balancing what they describe as the default mode network, the awareness of self, the ego, with the task positive network, so goal-oriented behavior. So I'm sitting there with a purpose to answer questions, to give context, to see things the person is asking me about, or to speak with certain spirits, whilst I'm also highly aware of myself, what's happening internally, and having to balance those two things. And what I thought was curious in the research is that after having the psychedelic experience, they were able to measure that the task positive network and the default mode network were more balanced in people, rather than a seesaw, as Vlad described, that one was more prominent than the other and they couldn't exist simultaneously. So in readings, somehow, with training and everything I've done, that's able to be more balanced. Also in spiritualism, generally, again, we're always talking about moving out of the mind and opening the mind to be receptive and non-rigid in thinking and beliefs. So this is especially important when communicating with spirits or channeling. A good sign the information is genuinely psychic is that it will be surprising even to the reader receiving the information. Ego is a huge one. So in the paper, they talk about ego a lot, and they reference a lot of Freud and Jung and other ways of comprehending the ego. And as Vlad mentioned, there is a forced dissolution of the ego with drugs. Obviously, when you're practicing, you don't have that blunt instrument. And so the ability to neutralize the ego is, I feel, stronger with someone who does the work on themselves through meditation, psychologically, or other forms of personal healing, to be able to sit in an egoless state at will for a period of time with others with a set purpose, rather than having it administered to them coming out of it and not having that background work to help them achieve that again, pardon me, without drugs. Magical thinking is prevalent in New Age communities. So typically in the way that everyday messages are received, such as recurring numbers, synchronicities, and messages in symbology, usually has a powerful sense of meaning and is profound for people. It's actually just part and parcel of being in a highly entropic state of conscious frequently as a medium, I find. And in the circle, everyone always discusses seeing these messages, or picking up on certain things, or asking me about something they found that was really peculiar. And obviously, there is a level at which we can't answer for sure that it's a psychic or medium message. I often say to the person, okay, well, how did it make you feel? How did it work for you personally, seeing that or having that happen in the moment? So another huge one in my experience that's difficult for people to fully grasp unless they've reached this stage themselves is the concept of unity, and is covered in the work of Jung. This is inherent in understanding that all life is one, and we do not exist in isolation or as individuals, and we are interdependent with all life. All things and divinity is one. So there's been some good references to that today in the talks. Finally, grounding is something not covered explicitly in the paper. However, it is linked, I think, to subcriticality. So grounding would be an active form of reverting back on the scale down to subcriticality. So basically some examples of grounding in spiritualism is noticing your feet on the ground, noticing the light in your eyes and bringing yourself back to physical awareness, drinking something to activate the DMN, basically. Next slide. There is a short video of a meditation I gave a few years ago. If anyone's interested, we can play later. But otherwise, if you'd like to participate, I can perform a short meditation just on mindfulness. And so the mindfulness meditation is a good way of either bringing you back to a centered, grounded place, and it's also a good way of just relaxing and starting to move into a higher entropic state. Okay, so just make sure you're seated comfortably. Take a moment to wiggle around and take a deep breath in and out, maybe a few times. Just feel your body start to relax. Bring your focus inward into yourself and your body. Notice any tension or discomfort. And keep using your breath to connect with different areas of your body without judgment. Stay very present. Keep using your out breath to calm down and relax. Feel the sensations of the air on your face and hands, or from the clothing you're wearing. Notice the weight of your body in the chair and your feet on the ground. If any thoughts or judgments arise, just bring your attention straight back to the present moment and don't attach to anything. You might like to cycle through your senses, so sense of smell, hearing, touch, your emotions. And we'll just sit like this for about a minute. Okay, so that marks a minute. Just gently bring yourself back to the present room. Notice the light in your eyes. Your consciousness back. So that was a good example of beginning to revert to a baseline level of activity. And as I described, you can use that either to get back to a default mode network, or you can shift into entropic state, a highly entropic state. So that would mark the end of the presentation, and it's time for questions. I'll hand over to Vlad as well.
Thank you for the presentation. Everything was very clear, except I didn't get very well what you meant by sensory deprivation. I was just wondering if you could expand on what that means. So, in the extreme case of sensory deprivation, we're talking about, depriving the senses. So depriving your eyes, depriving your hearing, depriving your touch. The most extreme case I can think of is sensory deprivation tanks, flotation tanks, filled with a bit of water, saturated with magnesium sulfate, and you just lie there in the dark. You can't hear, you can't see, you can't feel. And that a lot of people have experienced a lot of weird, wonderful experiences there. Some people feel uncomfortable, other people just go straight into this alternate kind of weird reality. But there are more subtle variations, like literally eye masks, keeping in a dark room, those kinds of techniques.
Yeah, just in the circle, like Vlad's right, it's literally sensory deprivation. But in the circle, I would say to people on a daily basis, just reduce how much you're smelling in your home, how much the light is. Just sort of what I find is we sort of race through life, and often we're not even aware of the amount of senses that are being activated at any given time. Like you just walk into a supermarket and you're bombarded with music, lights, people, everything. And so calming that down and bringing it down holistically, like just in even very simple ways as Vlad described, can help to increase your awareness and increase the sensitivity. Yeah.
I've got a question.
Yeah. Grab the microphone.
This question for Vlad here. I recently went to a talk where a man from England worked for 30 years in the music industry, and he said that today musical instruments are tuned to artificial 440 hertz. He said that this allows subliminal messages to be used in the music industry and in advertising. The natural frequency is 330 hertz, but now music instruments are tuned to 440 hertz. Okay, got any ideas about that?
I'm not entirely sure what that means to be tuned to 330 hertz. That's literally one frequency.
Well, he said that music instruments used to be tuned to a natural frequency of 330 hertz, but today all musical instruments are tuned to 440 hertz, which is an artificial frequency, because they use subliminal messages in advertising and in the music industry.
I'm not sure. 440 hertz is just as natural as 330, just as natural as 350.
Yeah.
They're all natural frequencies.
Now they allow messages to be used in songs and in advertising.
Yeah, I'm not entirely up to date with the tuning standards. I've heard of this before. That yes, there was some standardization of the music industry a fair while ago, and quite a lot of people were protesting that. But I'm not up to date with the details. I do find it hard to understand how you would use it how that would make it easier for subliminal messages to come through. Though
you work as a DJ and for record companies for 30 years, so you've seen changes over the last 30 years in the music industry. And he came to the conclusion that the music is now used to brainwash young people.
Yeah.
So, I think there's still, there probably have to be studies done about the effects the actual hertz has on the brain, and we're not able to scientifically study how the frequencies of that kind of music impact us energetically. But I do know from anecdotal reports of people who listen to different types of binaural beats and music at different hertz levels available on YouTube and different access, that some ranges work better for others than other people. So I know some people who prefer a range, between, I don't know what the hertz levels are, I don't use it myself. So it may work really beneficially for one person and negatively for another. And in my experience, there's so much variance between us and our energies. Even over time, we sort of tend to shift a bit, that I don't believe that one range of hertz or energy is blanket going to cause harm to a population of people, because there's just so much variance individually. But that's my take.
Yeah, that actually jogged my memory, because I remember looking at a few YouTube videos. There's lots of YouTube videos of people putting up various frequencies, various beats and things. One to heal your fifth dimensional DNA, and I'm not sure what else, but there's lots of stuff. One to put you into a induce out of body experiences, some to cause something else. But the interesting thing is the comment sections, that some people swear by it, saying this definitely works, this is the greatest, and then other people say this did nothing for me. I actually found a different frequency that was better able to assist. So I think that kind of reflects what Cherie was saying, that depending on the individual, the effect.
Do you agree that subliminal messages are used in advertising?
No. I know it has been used as an experiment, and I know that there's a lot of amoral ways that advertising is done. There is a potential for subliminal advertising, but I'm not sure. I actually don't understand how the mechanism behind how one particular frequency is used to induce that. You probably should be more concerned about the fact that all of your electronic devices are technically listening in on your activity, and this is actually practiced ultrasonic. So there are ultrasonic signals being recorded by all devices because they are legally allowed to be recorded. Companies have rules say we cannot record your voice or audible frequencies whilst the phone is being used. It's illegal. But they're not restricted from recording frequencies outside of that ultrasound. And so what they've done is some weird combination. If you're at your computer and you watch an ad on your computer, that ad is embedded with ultrasonic signals, which is picked up by a phone. And then that sends it to the media companies to say, oh, okay, that person has watched that particular ad, which means that either they might be interested, so we can give them more of that same ad, or something else. And you're right, there's a lot of dodgy stuff happening in media, but I honestly, I personally don't understand how the mechanisms of the subliminal stuff. But I can't exclude that possibility. Yeah.
I think this comes back to the original question we had, which is reduce center input. So turn off your phone, turn off the radio, turn off the TV, and just relax. Don't worry about conspiracies and different things.
Good advice.
Were there any other questions?
Just at the beginning, you talked about the Walter Stace theory, and in one of the 7 elements, it was diminished subjectivity and increased objectivity. That was interesting. I thought it would be the other way around. Can you expand on that?
So in the paper, when they describe that, they use the terms almost interchangeably because there's, for the sake of those categories, it's basically an increased sense of, it's one of those things where it's a paradox. So you simultaneously become more subjective while being more objective, if that makes sense. We've got a question over here.
I'm glad you touched on that just then, because I was going to ask, what happens when there ceases to be a difference between subjectivity and objectivity?
So from personal experience in readings, you can receive more information, and same as in psychedelic states, you're much more receptive, but you also have objectivity to observe the states. And some people even go into third person, they see themselves, even in meditations I give sometimes. So does that? Yeah.
The ego goes back.
Yes, yeah.
So you become virtual.
Yeah. And all is one.
Are there any other questions?
Yeah.
Yeah.
How does the magnetic use of reducing the effects of the brain stimulation, has there been any negative effects if you use the magnets too often, or they do it repeatedly?
Potentially, yeah. So, I mean, it's TMS, transcranial magnetic stimulation. It's an absolutely wonderful tool for probing the brain because it's non-invasive. You give a pulse, and you can modulate almost any brain activity that's near the surface. So, if I ask someone to speak, and during the middle of the speech I give it a stimulus, you can actually interrupt the speech. If you get them to sit there and you stimulate the part of the brain that monitors muscle activity, you can make their muscles twitch. You can make them move. So it's used for depression, for example. If you stimulate the frontal lobes, you stimulate one to make it more active, and so on. You can alleviate the symptoms of depression for a considerable period of time. So it's got lots of function. But yes, you're right. If you use it inappropriately or too much, it can have negative consequences. I'm not sure if I should share this, but when I was talking about the medial temporal lobe and how you can stimulate it with weak magnetic fields, I purchased a unit from Michael Persinger's group. They were selling these commercial units, which are really weak signals, really weak little magnets, solenoids, and they're probably 10 times stronger than the Earth's magnetic field. So it's not really that strong. And in fact, you ask any neuroscientist, I spoke to neurologists and so on, and I said, can these things affect your brain? And they laughed at me. They said, no, there's no way. You need to have TMS is usually 1.5 Tesla. It's a huge amount. So they said no. But the reason why I was asking them was because I tried this. I tried stimulating my brain to induce an out-of-body experience. I've always been interested in out-of-body experiences. But I put it on, and against suggestions, I got bored and I just started shifting it around. So it's not doing anything. I'll try something else, and stimulated for about an hour. And I had inadvertently induced a state of hypomania in myself for about 7 days. So I didn't know what hypomania is. It wasn't a complete manic state, but it was definitely had symptoms that, which 2 years later I found out what that actual state was, and it finally clicked in my head that I had inadvertently done something which is potentially dangerous. So I really had to step back and actually show a bit more respect for the magnetic stimulation. So yes, there are potential negatives.
Thank you so much, Vladimir and Cherie. We have another round of applause for you.